Okay, it's 9 o'clock, and we're going to go ahead and get started. There are people logging in, so I'll give you a few minutes to get logged in, and then we'll go over some housekeeping stuff, and then we'll get into taking a look at the new release of information. And if you would, if you'll notice, I've got a screenshot here of what your screen should look like. And you have a little raised hand option up here at the top. If you can hear me, would you raise your hand? Okay, excellent. All right, great. Thank you. I appreciate it. Okay, so let me take you through just a few pieces. If you haven't been used our Zoom platform before, I'm going to give you a few instructions about how it works. So you'll see here up in the upper left-hand corner of your screen, you've got a few little options. Over here to the left, you have audio settings, so you can click there if you're having problems with audio going in and out. Hopefully that won't happen. My connection today is fast enough that we won't have that happen. Next to that, you have this Q&A button. What I would like you to do is use that Q&A button. If there are questions that come up during this presentation, click on that, enter your question there, and rather than answering those questions as we go, I'm going to save those questions till the end so that we can get them all at once and we can get through the contents of the webinar quickly, and then catch any questions that we have at the end. You also have a little option here for chat, and that's if if there's the presentation today that you want to ask questions of or have comments to make, you can use that little chat option, and you'll have to figure out how to use the hand button. And because I've shared my screen for this presentation, my screen is probably taking over your screen. So you have some options over here to the right that'll allow you, if you need to reduce that the presentation from full screen, you can do that with those buttons over there. So let's get into our presentation. So the reason we're doing this webinar today is because there are some updates that we've made to the release of information, hopefully to simplify it a bit and also to get the information to go the most quickly. So the new release of information will become live in CareLogic as of March 16th, and we'll be rolling out versions of that as well, probably a little bit before this, so that we have them available for the 16th. And so what we're going to do today is go through the release of information, and I'll show you, and there's not a lot of new stuff there, but there are a few tweaks to it. But I want to show you, take this opportunity to show you what fields are required and need to be filled out in the release of information so that we have a properly executed release of information. So before we get into that, let me just give you a reason for the purpose that we use releases of information, and it's fairly simple. Legally, we're required to get a client or guardian's written consent whenever we propose releasing information or exchanging information about the client with a third party. So, another provider, a family member, whoever. We're required to have written consent, not just verbal. The release also is meant to specify exactly what kind of information the client or guardian has given us consent to release or to receive or to exchange from, with somebody else. And then, finally, the purpose of the release is to ensure that the records are exchanged as specified in the release. So that's just your sort of your 10,000 foot view of the purpose of the release of information. So what I'm going to do now is walk through the changes to the release using screenshots of the actual releases that you'll be using. And then we'll go back through that information. I have that information as part of this PowerPoint, and you'll get a copy of this PowerPoint at the end of the presentation today. So this is what the paper release of information looks like. There's not a whole lot that's different here. The fields that are highlighted in yellow are the fields that you're required to fill out. So this is the upper portion of the release of information. Of course, you always have to have the name of the client and their date of birth on the release. And keep in mind that it's the name of the client. So you should always, when you're filling out a release of information, you're not going to fill out releases for anyone other than the client. So in other words, if for some reason a party has requested information, say about a parent of a client that we're serving, the name of the client is still going to be the actual client who's entered it. So in other words, we should never have releases of information for anybody other than clients who are in our system. And of course, you have to name that person or agency to whom the release is either or whom we're requesting to exchange information with. So if it's DFACS, you're going to put the DFACS there. You need to have, and if it's DFACS, for instance, you can say Warren County DFACS or Lumpkin County DFACS or whoever. You don't necessarily have to have a specific name of a case manager there. You are required to have an address, and we'll expand on that here in a little bit, but you should always have an address for the name of that person or agency. How else are we supposed to know where to send information from or to request information from if we don't have an address? And you can see underneath that, you could specify the type of person or agency that we're requesting to exchange information with. So you've got 4 options there: individual, so like a family member, grandparent, aunt, uncle. A PCP, and I've highlighted that, that's primary care physician. That's a very important one. You should always be asking if a client has a primary care physician, and if they do, we need a release of information for that primary care physician. A specialty, if it's some sort of specialty medical practice, and then other, to sort of catch anything else that might come along. If the release of information is individual, an aunt or an uncle or a grandparent or something like that, at a minimum, we need to have an indication of that individual's relationship to the client. So if they're a family friend, if they're the neighbor next door, and for some reason they're going to be participating in that client's treatment, there needs to be a release of information, and you need to give some kind of indication of what their relationship is to the client. Now, for individuals where we're not likely to be requesting records or sending records, you don't necessarily have to have an address for release of information to an individual, but if you can, it would be good to put it if you have it. You do have to provide that relationship information, though. The check boxes here below that specify what kinds of information to exchange. The box here that's above those check boxes that says initials needs to be initialed by the client or the guardian, indicating that they are allowing the release of whatever specific information you've checked in the check boxes below. And that's very important. We need to be explaining to clients what kinds of information we're requesting to exchange. And so that's your opportunity to explain what that information is. And so you have a variety of options there: treatment plans, progress notes, discharge summary, those sorts of things. I've highlighted a couple things. We've added to this release of information a checkbox over there to the right for permission to participate in treatment. So most likely that's an option that you would select if you've selected in type of person or agency, if you've selected individual. So that allows that individual permission to participate in treatment. If you select other, for instance, if there are records or specific piece of information that isn't covered by any of those checkboxes and you check other, then you need to explain what other means in that field that's down there at the bottom of those checkboxes. And then the last thing on this screen is the statement about disclosing information about alcohol or drug abuse. So the client, and if the client is a minor client, both the client and the guardian need to initial that they give permission. If they give permission, make sure that that's not filled out. If they would prefer that information about substance use treatment or drug screens or whatever is not shared, then don't have them initial anything there. So the only time they're going to initial those boxes is if they've given specific information or specific consent to exchange information about substance use. This you'll see at the bottom of the release, a few things that are highlighted here. So with the release of information is only good for a year. So most of the time you'll probably select that option that says 1 year, unless there are other reasons that say a client only wants that release of information to be valid for a certain period of time. You can check the box to the right that says the period necessary to complete all transactions on accounts related to services provided to me. So just keep that in mind. The client can limit the amount of time that a release of information is good for, and we'll talk about withdrawing consent here in a minute. The client or the client's guardian, if it's a minor client, needs to sign the release of information, and please print the name of whoever it is that signs that release of information. We need to be able to verify who the person actually is, and we all know that signatures aren't always super clear. Make sure there's a date on the release of information. The witness needs to sign, and that can be you as the staff person who's having the individual complete the release of information. Print your name out as well. We can't always recognize your signatures. And you'll notice on the paper release that there's an option for the client to, if they would like to request a copy of the release, and we can provide that to them. So just make sure that the appropriate box is checked there. And then you'll see down on the bottom of the release where it says for Georgia Hope use only, you need to specify what the purpose is of this release. And so you've got 4 options: send records, and you've got a blank there where you would specify specifically what records need to be sent to the releasee. Request records, make sure you've selected the right stuff in the checkboxes above, or that you've specified specific records that you want. You have a new option here, send PCP letter. And so obviously, if this is a release of information for a primary care physician, you want to make sure that if a letter has been sent already to the primary care provider, make sure that you check that send PCP letter box. So you'll update releases of information annually. So if a letter has already been sent to a primary care physician under previous release of information, you don't need to check that box again. You may just at that point then check file only down at the bottom. And file only is basically when we need a release of information just to be able to maybe talk by phone or exchange information electronically with another source. That makes sure that we have permission to do that on file. So just make sure that you have selected some option in those checkboxes at the bottom. Okay, so that's the paper release. So the way this looks in CareLogic, basically the same fields are required. CareLogic does something a little different though. We can actually make it required. You can't complete the release without providing some information. So what you're seeing here is basically if you, the type of person or agency you select at the top is primary care physician, specialty, or other. The form in CareLogic is going to require you to enter a phone number and an address of that person or agency. And we opted to make this a requirement because too often we're seeing releases of information that get completed without having that information included. And it's very difficult and time consuming for our record staff to track down this information. And honestly, they will not respond to a request that doesn't have this information included in it. It's not within their scope of daily activities to track down these addresses. So you're going to need to do that. But if you're in CareLogic and you're doing a release of information electronically, you should also then be connected to the internet and have the ability to search and find that information. So just make sure that it's included. The exception here, as I mentioned with the paper release, is that if the client is an individual, or rather the person that we're releasing information to or exchanging with is an individual, you will be required to enter that person's name, obviously, and you'll be required to indicate what their relationship is to the client. Now, you still have the fields there to add an address and a phone number, and if you have it, I would like for you to enter that information there, but at a minimum, you need to have the person's name and you need to have their relationship to the client. Now, I'd say we actually, Sonia Early and her team have done some great work with the release of information, and I've pulled this one piece out. So you'll see back here, up at the top of the release of information, you have this field that says select, please choose release to from. So a cool thing that Sonia and her staff have done is to add into CareLogic a number of agencies with their addresses and phone number information. And so if, for instance, the example you see here says Agape Youth Behavioral Health. So if that's who you're wanting to exchange information with, their address information is already in CareLogic. This list is updatable, and so we can add new providers or agencies or whatever we want to this list so that you can just click on a drop down and find that agency in CareLogic. And if it's not there and it's one that you use frequently, then we have the ability to add that in so that you don't have to do an internet search to find that information. So I'm excited about that. I hope you all are too. Makes our job a little bit easier and a little bit quicker. So again, this mirrors the same thing that we saw on the paper release. Some things to know about this. certain of these checkboxes. So if you check that other checkbox, and you need to select at least one box from this section of different types of information to exchange. If you select other, you will be required to explain what other means. So if there's a specific piece of information, somebody wants a BHA that was completed on January 31st, 2017, you can specify specifically that piece of information. If you check that other box, and it'll require you to fill that in. In the electronic release, the permission for disclosing concerning alcohol or drug abuse information, that's a checkbox, but note that both, if this is a minor client, both the minor client and the guardian have to agree to that release before you can check that yes, the yes box there. So just keep that in mind. There's not a way to do initials on this form in the electronic version, so that's what you're seeing there. And then the electronic release, again, mirrors the same thing as a paper release. Select an option there for either 1 year or the period necessary to complete. And again, typically your releases are going to be good for 1 year. Now, one thing I do want to say about that, if a client is closed before that 1 year time period has ended, that release of information is no longer valid. So when a client is closed, a release of information is no longer valid. So just keep that in mind. You have the same boxes at the bottom for Georgia Hope use only. So you see file only, send PCP letter, send records, or request records. That send PCP letter is an important checkbox. If it's a PCP, make sure that that's checked, and we'll talk about how that gets followed up on here in a minute. But that's our reminder for our records department to send that PCP letter. And then finally, the signatures portion of the release of information. So in some cases, if the client is an adult client, where you see select signatory, their name should pop up in that drop-down. And again, this is, since we're getting handwritten signatures, we need to be able to know whose signature that is. And so if it's an adult client and they signed their release, you can just select their name in that select signatory. If it's the guardian of a client and that is not in that drop-down, you can use that enter new signatory box to type in the name of the person who has signed that release. And please do that. We need to know that releases are signed by the appropriate person. So enter a name there if the name isn't available in that drop-down. So I've gone through all of this information, the required information, but I wanted to pull it out specifically so that when you get a copy of this PowerPoint, you have it. This is basically the same information that we went over earlier: name, date of birth, name and address for all those folks, PCP, specialty, and other. You have the drop-downs now. Make sure you're indicating primary care provider, and you've got all the same information that we just went over. I also put this in here just to remind myself in case there was anything that I had left out as we went through the actual forms. Required information, again, same thing about initialing boxes for substance use. You've got the information there about the release of information only being good for a year. Legible signatures need to include a witness signature. And on the paper release, checking accepted or declined for a copy of the release of information. Making sure you've, in that for Georgia Hope use only, that you've made a selection. Now, some other pieces of information that we haven't hit on yet. So this just explains what those boxes are goes into a little more detail in the for Georgia Hope use only. So the options: send records request, send PCP letter, and file only. So this gives you sort of the explanation of what those options are about. Now, let me point out something here with the send records. If you have selected send records, if it's clear on the release of information exactly what records you want to be sent, that's fine. But if you need to specify a little bit more detail, you can send an email to records@gahope.org to make sure our records department knows if there are specific additional pieces of information that they need to have before sending information. You know, the other options are fairly self-explanatory. Make sure that you're using that send PCP letter. We've had a problem with the connection between getting PCP releases signed and getting PCP letters sent, and I suspect that some of it has to do that there's a breakdown in communication sometimes. So make sure that you're using that option. And I think I've already explained the file only option. Now, so I'll hit the exceptions here. An address and a phone number is preferred, but it's not required on a release of information for an individual unless there are specific records that need to be exchanged with the individual. So in other words, if we're going to be sending, you know, if a grandmother is, or rather, if a grandmother wants to have a copy of the client's behavioral health assessment, for instance, and they're participating in treatment, in order for us, and you know, obviously the guardian's going to sign a release of information to allow that. But if there's paperwork that needs to be sent to somebody, make sure there's an address on that release. And you know, again, you've got to put a relationship in there if it's for an individual. The ROI should be marked as file only if there's not paperwork that's being exchanged, just allowing communication between us and someone else. So processing paper releases of information and PCP letters. So this is very important information. So we need to make sure that for every client that has a primary care provider, that one, we have gotten a release of information signed, and two, that primary care provider gets a letter from us explaining our involvement with the client. So here's how we want to make sure that you do that. There are scanning folders at both the Dalton and the Woodstock offices for paper releases of information. So if you've had a paper release of information and you want it scanned, make sure it goes into one of those scanning folders. Or if you scan it yourself, then make sure that you have scanned the release as one document. So in other words, you don't want to scan a bunch of pieces of paper together, because what happens then is our records folks then our scans folks have to separate those out into individual documents, and it takes them too much time to do that. So releases should be scanned individually. Any other paper intake document, you know, a plan of care, a crisis plan, whatever, each one of those things needs to be scanned as an individual document rather than just scanning the whole intake packet as one big document. And those get sent to scans@gahope.org. And you know, some of you use like CamScanner or some other scanning app that you can do from your phone. Just make sure that you're scanning releases as individual documents. Make sure there's a selection at the bottom for the send records, send PCP letter, request records, or whatever, so that it gets routed to the right place. So if you have scanned, or if you've checked send records, send PCP letter, or request records, and that paper release gets scanned, then our records department will get notified that that release is out there, and they will respond as needed. So make sure that you're making a selection there. That's our way of knowing, of ensuring that the paper release gets to the right person before it just goes, before it just gets filed. And that's especially important for PCPs. So as the type of person agency, you want to make sure PCP is selected. You want to make sure that send PCP letter option is selected. And I think I've emphasized that a lot because it's very, very important that those options are made use of. So with the electronic releases and PCP letter, so the ROI only needs one staff signature if the release of information is only for the file. It's only to cover communication that doesn't require the exchange of client records. If the client has a PCP, then you have to have an ROI signed for the PCP. You got to indicate PCP as type of agency and person. And if records are to be sent, requested, or a PCP letter is to be sent, make sure that you send that ROI to Brooke Brock for second signature. So that will appear in her alerts, and that will let her know that either records need to be sent or requested, or a PCP letter needs to be sent. So that's how we make sure that with electronic releases that it goes to the right place, and that the right information gets requested. So clients have the right to revoke consent, which basically means if they choose to cut off that exchange of information with someone, someone that they've signed a release for, they can do that for any reason at any time. So that's extremely important. If they don't want, their primary care doc or DFACS or DJJ to have access to their information anymore, they can revoke consent. When that happens, the chart needs to reflect that. And really, we kicked around different ways of making sure that that happens. The best way to do that is if a client revokes consent, then a message needs to be entered in the client's message board that says, client revoked ROI for whoever the person or agency is on whatever the date is that they revoked that consent. So if you don't know how to get into a client's message board, make sure you check with a program manager, a team lead. They can show you how to do that. And there are also some specific instructions that you need to follow as far as the release itself goes. So for an electronic ROI, what you'll need to do is complete a duplicate release of information in CareLogic for the ROI that's going to be revoked. So if there was a release of information for DFACS, you'll need to complete a duplicate of that release of information. And then down at the bottom of that release of information, you'll see the place where you'll enter information about what's being revoked. So basically, you just need to enter there the date that that consent was revoked. And then you'll have the client or the guardian sign the release of information in the way that you normally would. So having a revoked release, an actual revoked release, and having a message in the message board is the way we're going to know that a client no longer wants us to be in contact with whoever the original release was for. And the way you'll do that on the paper consent, you can just print out a copy of the original release of information. You'll complete the section at the bottom of the ROI, and I'll show you where that is here in a minute, that adds the date that the ROI is revoked. You'll have them sign the ROI next to the date of withdrawal, and then make sure that you either scan that paper release to scans@gahope.org, or you put it in the scans folder at one of the Georgia Hope offices. And so here's what that looks like. So this is that section at the bottom. Use the space only if consumer withdraws consent. And it's fairly simple. They just are going to sign and put a date on that, the copy of that release. So as I said, consent can be revoked at any time that the client chooses to revoke that consent. So we're at questions. I saw a couple of things pop up here. Let me, oh, okay. So I don't know if this was really a question, but I'm gonna give shout out to Sonia Early and her team. An anonymous attendee said, thanks for adding that list of addresses and agencies in there. Yeah, and then Cindy had asked, is there a way for us to know, maybe by a pop-up, that the ROI is expired and a new one is needed? At this point, I don't know that there's a way to allow us to do that. That's something certainly that we can investigate. But one thing that we've encouraged staff to do is that whenever a reassessment occurs, which would happen at 6 months and then again at a year, all new paperwork should be signed. And so certainly you would catch those then. That's, at this point, that's the only way I know how to answer that question. It may be possible at some point to see if there's a feature in CareLogic that'll allow reminders. Another question, if DFACS is the payer, can the client still revoke the release of information? So the answer to that is a little complicated. Well, maybe not complicated. Actually, if DFACS is the payer for a client, then technically a release of information isn't needed. And this is sort of analogous to if you know, a client has CMO insurance, Amerigroup, Simpatico, CareSource, WellCare, then a release of information isn't needed for their insurance company in order for that payer, that insurance company, to access their records because they are paying for the service. So really, the client, you know, an ROI isn't necessarily needed if DFACS is the payer. Now, it's always a good idea to have one in place, but if a client does not want DFACS to have access to their information when DFACS is the payer, that's a different conversation than it would be, you know, than you would typically have about a release of information. And that's something I don't think is within the scope of this presentation, but certainly it would be a discussion that would need to be had, facilitated by our staff and whoever the DFACS case manager is, as to why they no longer wanted that access. So where do staff see if a request was processed? Well, shoot, I knew somebody would ask that. There's actually, and I can include this in an email when I send out the information about this presentation. There is in CareLogic a log of, you know, when information from a client's record is exchanged, and it's in the client's ECR. I just can't remember off the top of my head what the name, and if there's anybody on the presentation right now that knows the name of that menu link, feel free to chat it out to us. But there is a way to see in CareLogic when when releases of information, or rather exchanges of records, have occurred. And that question about where do we see if where records were sent would be in that same log. Now let me jump over here real quick to chat, because I think there's some folks that have probably answered that question for us. Oh, it's called records log. So it's in the client's ECR, and it's called records log. Sonia's looking for the exact path. I'm guessing that it's probably in clinical record, but don't quote me on that. So you'll look for a menu link called records log to see what's been exchanged. Okay, so yeah, so James Christ asked this question: if I send summaries by email to DFACS, can that be specified along with phone numbers rather than address? So let me say it this way: if DFACS is the entity that you are signing a release of information, or you're asking the client to sign a release of information for, you will need to add an address for DFACS. Now, I'm not sure if this has occurred yet. We're looking into adding our DFACS offices into that drop-down list, so that'll shorten that. Process a little bit. But let me also, that question prompted something that I want to point out. If some entity has requested records from us, make sure that those records requests get processed through records@gahope.org. So in other words, if DFACS calls you directly and says, I want a copy of this person's BHA, and there's a release of information, it's fine for us to send them the BHA, but send that request through records@gahope.org rather than you sending that record yourself. So hopefully that answered Jane's question and beyond. So if staff requests for records to be requested from PCP, okay, I think I understand this question. So if we've requested records from a primary care doc, does a PCP letter automatically get sent? I think the easiest way to answer that is check two options. And I believe that the release will allow you to do that. If we're requesting records from a PCP, but we also want to make sure that a PCP letter gets sent, then select both of those options in that section of the release. So hopefully that answers that question. Okay, and we have an answer for the records log. So it's ECR, the client ECR, client inquiry. There's a menu called inquiry. And then you'll scroll down to records sent log, records requested or received. And that'll give you a log of what kind of information has been exchanged out of a client's record. And that's entered by our really great records staff. They take care of those requests for information. So let me go back here to chat. It looks like there were a couple of questions that came in through chat. So from Stephanie, it states to specify record sent, but where do we put this on the electronic form? Can we add a box for send PCP letter on the electronic? Sometimes we already have PCP records with the referral, so we don't need to check request records again. Okay, so just make sure there is an option both on the paper and the electronic release that has that send PCP letter option on it. So if we've already gotten records from the PCP, they may have sent us records along with the referral that they sent to us, then you just need to select that send PCP letter option on the release, and that's on there. I'm not sure if I've answered Stephanie's question exactly. So if I haven't, Stephanie, feel free to chat out some clarification on that. Okay, so let's see here. I may not be understanding Stephanie's question because she's not understanding my response. So the release of information. Oh, okay. Okay. So maybe this is what you're asking. Okay. I see what you're saying, Stephanie. Yeah. So Stephanie, the reason you're not seeing a box for send PCP letter is because that will become part of the new release of information that will get implemented on March 16th. So this release of information isn't actually available in CareLogic yet. So it will be part of the new release. So we wanted, the reason we're doing this today and we're not actually sending out the release of information until the 16th is because we didn't expect that everybody that needed to see this webinar would be able to see it today. So we're recording it. Folks will have a chance to view it between now and March 16th. You'll see all these options become available on March 16th. Okay, so I think we got through all the questions. Now, the last slide here, guess what? There's a quiz. And so we started implementing this idea of having quizzes that sort of test people's knowledge of the of basic competencies. And so you're going to get a link with this quiz that's on SurveyMonkey. And so what you'll need to do is go through the quiz, and at the you'll enter some information. You'll enter your information. Your password to complete the quiz will be your Georgia Hope email address. So make sure that you take this quiz now that you've viewed the webinar, and once you do that, that'll let us know that you have, hopefully understood the information that we presented today. So you can't click through to this link right now from this presentation, but like I said, we'll email you out the link here in just a little bit, just by the end of the day today. So take the quiz, and we'll know when you've completed the quiz, and we'll get with program managers and team leads to make sure that everybody that needs this information has also completed the quiz and demonstrated that they've understood what we presented today. Let me go up here. It looks like we've got one more question. Cindy's asked, just to clarify, I've seen DFACS workers request paperwork via email, medication authorization or something else. And the question is, am I saying that the reply needs to come directly from records at GA Hope and not the person to whom the email is sent? Many times they do this to expedite things, and can the person send the material and then put a copy in the scans folder? So here's the answer to that, is that all records requests should go through records at gahope.org. So if you as a staff person receive a request from a DFACS worker for records, my suggestion would be that you respond to that person by saying, I forwarded your request to our records department to respond. And then we'll have the records department respond to that request for information, get that information sent out. And the reason for this is we want to have a centralized process for responding to all records requests, because we don't want records going out that are, I guess, in a sense, unmonitored in some way. And honestly, our records staff know that when they send information out, they know the process of how to record that exchange of information in CareLogic. And rather than training all staff on doing that, we prefer to have that exchange of information get processed through records so that we know that it happens the same way every time. And that's, that's fairly typical for a company like ours, or like your doctor's office, they typically have a records person that handles all requests for records, just so that it's done in a standardized way every time. So if you haven't been in the habit of doing that, if you've just responded to those requests yourself, then stop it. Let our records department do that. And it's as simple as forwarding, those emailed requests to our records folks so that they can process the request that's been made. So I'm not seeing any other questions pop up. I don't see any other things coming in. Oh, I spoke too soon. There's a couple of things. Do the doctors know this process? So I'm not sure. I'm going to assume that what that means is if our docs have gotten requests for records, do they know how to respond? Honestly, I don't know for sure. I would hope that they do. I would hope that they're letting someone know when they get these records requests. I'm not sure if I should presume that when they get those records requests, they're sending them directly. I hope that's not the case. So I'm not exactly sure how to answer that question, but this webinar will be available to them as well, so that they're clued in as to how they need to respond to those records requests. Process for urgent records requests. So we can respond fairly quickly to requests for records. There are any number of different scenarios. Our typical response time, we're required to respond to a request for records within 7 days, I believe it is. But certainly we always try to get information out as quickly as possible. So if somebody requests information, for example, a client is, being admitted to a hospital in a crisis situation, we can certainly expedite that process if we need to. Now, if the request for records is urgent because for some reason somebody didn't think to request those records in a timely manner, again, we will do our best to respond to those requests as quickly as possible. But we do specify that that we allow for up to 7 days to respond to a request. We'll always do our best, but even with urgent records requests, those responses need to come from our records department rather than directly from staff. Now let me jump over here and see. Okay. Okay, and Sonia has indicated that we can check with Brandy, who's our medical coordinator, about the docs knowing about records requests. Staff should email records and mark the email as urgent. Okay, this is not to be utilized on all records. This is from an anonymous attendee. I'm not going to guess who that is. But just a piece of information to share with you. So yeah, if you have gotten an urgent request for records, you can send an email to records@GA Hope and mark that request as urgent or crisis, but don't abuse that. Not every records request is urgent. So just don't abuse the use of the words urgent or crisis. And you probably will find that the response that you get is much more timely and is much more friendly. So no crying wolf out there. Okay, so any more questions? I don't see anything else coming in. I'll give it a couple minutes. Make sure you take the quiz after the webinar. Yeah, you can put urgent in the subject line of the email, and that will alert our record staff also that piece of information just came in too. Okay, so I'm going to go forward here to the, so here's the quiz information again. So it's a, I think it's a 10-question quiz. And you'll pass it, and you'll have if you need it, a copy of the PowerPoint to use. Your password is your Georgia Hope email address. Don't use your personal email address or any other email address. Just use your Georgia Hope email address to complete the quiz. And I'm not seeing any other questions. So we're going to close this webinar. This will be posted to YouTube by this afternoon, and I'll send you out a link. So if you want to see it again, great. Team leads, program managers that are on, that's where your staff that were unable to attend today will need to go to view the webinar. I appreciate, it looks like we've got 50+ folks that were able to participate today. I appreciate all of you spending this time this morning, and for the great questions that you threw out there. That'll help us, that helps to clarify some of the issues that other folks seeing this in the future may have. So I'm going to go ahead and end the presentation for today. Thanks. If you have questions that you think of later, please feel free to email me, dbaker@gahope.org, and have a great Friday and a great weekend. All right. See y'all. Oh, and one other question, sorry, this one just came in at the last minute. Are we able to release third-party records? And the answer to that is no. So if someone else has done a psychological on a client, for instance, and we have requested that and we have that in our records, we cannot re-release that to someone else. So if someone else wants a copy of that psychological evaluation, they need to request that directly from whoever did that psychological. And that's very important. It's the same way with our records. If we release our records on a client to someone, we specify that those records cannot be re-released, that they need to come directly to us if they want original records that we've created. And that's pretty much the industry standard, that you don't re-release third-party records. So great question, and thanks for asking that one. Okay, so now I think that we're done. All right. Again, thanks to everybody that was able to participate today, and have a great weekend. We'll see you.